political reform of the progressive era. So before we were looking at how society is changing, but what about politics? Well, if you're going to talk about political reform of the progressive era, you gotta bring up women's suffrage. So this movement had, yes, begun back in the mid-19th century. And the biggest issue it faced was that women's suffrage, women gaining the right to vote, basically challenged the so-called natural order of society of that time. And so it generates a lot of opposition amongst men and women. However, most women progressives of this time period really saw suffrage as the key issue, because if women gained the vote, that meant they could have the power to convince politicians to take seriously all the demands they had for social reform. Plus, it meant that they could participate fully in the electoral process. And so this is just a way of advancing the status of women. So the thing is, in the early 20th century, suffragists are going to begin to outflank some of the traditional opposition to them. They'd have all kinds of activist tactics like parades, mass meetings. They'd have suffrage tours around the nation, and they would organize them by like political districts. But the big thing that really helps is they had a new argument. Basically, they argued that, well, women are supposed to be, the moral part of society. They're the maternal part of society. And therefore, to give women the vote would bring that moral and maternal instinct to politics, which was drastically needed. Now, this is a lot less of a radical idea. This is presenting basically a new image that's a lot more acceptable of why women should be allowed to vote. It appeals to all of those conventional views of women. And so we start seeing women begin to prevail. And in fact, by 1919, 39 states had established either full or partial women's suffrage in the United States. And then 1920 brings the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. This was a critical advance when it comes to political democracy, because now the nation is much more democratic because much more can be involved in how it is being run. But there's other ways that politics and government was reformed during this time period. For instance, we have the adoption of the Australian ballot, or the secret ballot is adopted by basically most states during the 1890s. Now, we've talked about some issues of that with disenfranchisement, but generally speaking, secret voting freed up voters from intimidation, and it discouraged vote buying, because as much as someone could pay for you to vote for them, there's an element of they could never be sure if you actually did vote for them. So it's kind of freeing up the election process from corruption. It also leads to more orderly elections. We also get public regulation of other parts of the electoral process, such as like direct primaries would remove nominations from these boss-ridden caucuses and the convention center. So we're seeing basically reforms to campaign practices. But this does mean there's a decreasing ability to mobilize voters. When parties knew that they had bought certain people's votes, they were going to make sure they went to vote. But if they weren't sure if someone was going to vote for them, they might not ensure that they got to the polls. And so we see a steady decline in voter participation. Giving you an example of how much of a decline it is, in 1896, 79% of the eligible population voted. In 1920, it's only 49% of the eligible population voted. Now, that being said, 1920, you have to also keep in mind that's when women get the vote. So there's a whole new group who have never voted before, and a lot of times you'll see a lot of times, even today, people talk about young people don't vote, young people don't vote. And a lot of times it's getting used to the idea of voting and then getting registered to vote and things like that are just impeding them. And so the fact that this is the first year that women could vote kind of calls for some of that drastic decline. But a lot of it's also because these parties aren't necessarily making sure people get to the voting booths anymore. We're also going to see that parties are just declining during this time because groups with narrower objectives are going to gain influence. So these kinds of special interest groups are going to organize for like lobbying during this time period, more so than like national parties. Plus, you have disenfranchisement undermining American democracy. Of course, we've seen a lot of the disenfranchisement of Black people, but also poor white people as well. You're seeing this now move across the United States with even the North will have things like literacy tests and more. And then you get the abolition of the right of aliens to vote. So we're seeing that nativist and anti-immigrant feeling come into this, which really brings us to the state governments. We are seeing the state governments being reshaped during this time period to become more democratic. Especially in the legislative portion of the state governments. Basically, a lot of people saw state legislatures as ineffective and corrupt during this time period. And so reformers are going to start proposing that legislation should be directly put to the electorate. This would bypass that unresponsive legislature. So you get things like referendum voting, permitting voters to approve and reject legislative measures. You see this today, that you'll see, especially when voting season comes up, you'll see signs out that's vote yes on Proposition 8 or vote no on Proposition 8, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's we, the people, directly vote in legislative measures rather than voting for someone to be on the state legislature who then votes for those measures. However, this can be turned on its head because you can have then like propaganda swaying the electorate one way or another, and sometimes swaying the electorate away from progressive measures. The other thing that we get during this time period is like the 17th Amendment. This is in 1913. This actually provided for the election of United States senators directly by popular vote rather than by state legislatures. So prior to this time, Americans would vote for a representative in their state legislature, and then they would pick someone to be the senator in Congress and in the Senate specifically. But now we see today we vote directly for our senators. We also get things like states recalling or having adoption of the recall measures, but basically enables voters to remove unsatisfactory public officials from office. And so with all of these kinds of measures, basically the state legislatures and the party machines are really going to be curbed. And so we're getting a larger, more complex mixture of ideas and objectives and groups all trying to reshape politics and government during this time period. So I ask you this, and you can look back at all of the reforms, not just this video. Why are these reforms important?